All right, so today we're going to be talking about the U.S. Constitution. We already kind of a little bit talked about it yesterday while we were in class about how the articles needed to get changed for obvious reasons. As we talked about, articles had major flaws with it. So let's get into it. Let's go. All right. So ultimately, what is the U.S. Constitution? What is it? It's going to be our second government. So it's going to be the supreme law of the land. So think about what we learned about under the Articles. Under the Articles of Confederation, states had more power than the federal government. States could print their own money. States had their own militaries. States could tax. The federal government had very little power. And as we talked about in class, became very apparent within the first couple of years that the Articles had major flaws with it. So obviously, with drafting a new constitution, the U.S. Constitution, um, we needed to make some changes. And the federal U.S. Constitution will now become supreme law of the land. Now, think about what that means. Supreme. Something supreme, that means it's superior. That means it's higher. So that means that the federal Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is higher than the state constitutions. So each state will have their own constitutions, their own rules still, their own laws, but whatever's in the federal one is supreme. It's higher. It must be followed by the states. So states are going to have a lot more power. Or, I'm sorry, the federal government is going to have a lot more power now. They're going to fix some of the wrongs under the articles. So in the Constitution, this is the foundation, the source of all legal authority that the federal government has. They outline it. This is what the president can do. This is what Congress can do. Here's what the courts can do. So they lay it out pretty thoroughly within the document about what federal government can and can't do, but it also lays out any other powers are now given to the states. So this document is the framework. It's the organization for how our government is going to run and how the three branches run, as we'll talk about. All right, so what are the basic principles? So there are four basic principles in the Constitution. Now, again, next year in government, you're going to go a lot more into detail with this. I'm kind of just introducing it to you now. But you have the idea of popular sovereignty, that government, the power of the government resides in the people. Oh my God, which philosopher is that? That's Rousseau. Remember? Consent of the governed, popular sovereignty, power resides with the people. That's a democratic principle. That is Rousseau. So that shows, again, that Enlightenment thinkers like Rousseau is going to have a major impact on how our new government is going to be run. Okay. The second major principle is the idea of limited government, that government is not all powerful, that yes, the federal government will have more power, but ultimately power resides with the people. How? Through elections. That the government can only do what the people let it do. So obviously through elections, we have a huge voice on what we allow and don't allow to happen in our government. So that's limited government. The third major principle is something called separation of powers. Again, we talked about this already. This is a Montesquieu, again, Enlightenment philosopher idea that we wanted to take power from one person, which was the king at one point, take it and divide it up into three separate branches. So this is going to ultimately help prevent one branch from becoming way too powerful and set up the system of checks and balances. So again, separation of powers, Montesquieu. This is definitely a Montesquieu principle. And then last but not least is something called federalism. Basically what this is that you're dividing powers up between federal and state governments. So again, this is something that was very important to the anti-federalists. They wanted to make sure that states maintained certain rights. Think about yesterday in class. We talked about schools. That's a state issue. Roads. It's a state issue. Infrastructure, bridges. That's a state issue. Hunting and fishing license. State issue. So again, it's going to allow and maintain for states to have their own power, their own sovereignty too. But again, kind of giving federal government more power too to make common sense things like let's have one common currency. It's a federal government thing now. States cannot print their own money. All right, a federal army. Boom. That's it. So so taking some of those major flaws from the articles, giving some powers to the federal government, but also maintaining power for the states. So checks and balances again, Montesquieu. So what's an example of that? Let's look at this one right here, the blue one. So Congress can make laws, but the president can veto a bill. So for instance, if Congress passed a law saying that all blondes can't drive, okay? Again, just saying what if. The president would have the power to veto that bill. Okay, so that's a checks and balance. So that means Congress can't pass any law they want. They can get checked and restrained by other branches. Or the courts, the judicial branch would say, you know what, that law is unconstitutional. Can't pass it. So that's, some of the things that we have. Or if we have a president, there have been a couple presidents that have been impeached. Richard Nixon is one of them who although he didn't get impeached, he would have gotten impeached. Bill Clinton, he got impeached. President Trump got impeached. Now we'll talk more about that later on. You'll learn more about that process. But again, the judicial branch and the legislative branch has power to impeach in those processes. All right, so who wrote the Constitution? James Madison. He's also known as the father of the Constitution. He had a major role in organizing and planning this. He also had other major contributions. You'll learn more about this in government next year. But the Virginia Plan, the idea of separation of powers, really putting that in to the Constitution. The Bill of Rights had a major part in that as well. So those were a couple of other major things that he implemented within the Constitution. Again, take some of those Enlightenment ideas. So when was it written? So part of May, June, July, August, about 4 to 5 months. From May 25th to September 17th, 1787, this document was written. And really some interesting things behind this is that this was kind of a secret meeting. They really didn't want a whole lot of hoopla, a whole lot of press getting kind of word about what's going on. But ultimately, after 10 years of having the articles, this is when basically they knew the articles had to be changed. And originally, so this meeting took place in Philadelphia. Originally, the intention of this meeting was to revise the articles, was to change it. But as they started to discuss and debate about the articles and about revising it, they quickly realized that simply revising it wasn't going to work, that this document basically just had to be replaced altogether, and they needed to create a brand new document, which is why it took 4 to 5 months. It takes a long time to create this document. So all these delegates from all different states came to Philadelphia, and they didn't leave until they created it. Again, as they had some really intense debate about it, as we talked about yesterday with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, about kind of where they wanted to see this country go. So they called this meeting the Constitutional Convention. This is where they convened to talk about the new Constitution, and this is where they drafted it. So as we talked about, they needed 9 out of 13 states to ratify or officially approve the Constitution before it went into effect. And again, that led to a lot of debate where they started writing the Constitution. They had to compromise within writing it, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So there was a lot of debate, a lot of compromise to finally, cause this to eventually come into effect. So as I talked about, huge debates emerged at the Constitutional Convention. Again, which is part of the reason why it took so long to draft. Now, the structure. The structure of this document is going to be broken up into 3 different parts. So if you were to actually read the Constitution, which next year in government, you're going to do some digging on this. But for this class, I'm not going to have you guys necessarily read it. The first section of the Constitution is the preamble. The preamble is like the introduction. It's the purpose of this document. Why is it being written? What is its purpose? So we the people. Again, an Enlightenment idea. The next section of the Constitution is something called the Articles. There are 7 articles in the Constitution. So it gives Article 1 is legislative branch. So obviously it gives all the powers to Congress, what they can and can't do. Executive branch. Article 2, again, what the power of the president can and can't do. You guys can go ahead and read this for yourself, but this lays out the structure of the government and their roles and their rules and what they can and can't do. And finally, the third section of the Constitution is the amendments. Now, we currently right now have 27 amendments, but it wasn't always that way. We originally started off with 10. And then over the years, we added more. So the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. Now again, I want to make this clear. The Bill of Rights is in the Constitution. Those aren't really two separate documents. It's all one document. The Bill of Rights is just a section in it. Okay, so what you're going to do now, I have a worksheet that looks like this. I'm already going to explain it to you. And it has the amendments. The Bill of Rights are on this. And what you're going to do is you're going to read it. And on the back is, what you have to do is to try to decide which amendment is being described. Pretty simple. All right, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. All right, adios.